Alright guys, this is just a short video that's intended to give you some things to think about linguistic self-defense is what I'm going to call it. And it's about really protecting your peace in difficult interactions, because one of the things I've noticed throughout the course of my life is that a lot of the things that people confide in me in terms of frustrations and complaints really have a basis in their interactions with other people. I was saying this and they said that, I can't believe they said that, and that sort of thing. And the impression I've got over the years is that these things live in people's heads. And it's not just me, Um, this is a recognized effect of what I'll call sort of problematic communication. Now, I've just had a really good chat with a friend of mine, Mike, who's a behavioral scientist, and we were talking about how thinking of behaviors in terms of good or bad behaviors is not necessarily particularly productive, but thinking of them in terms of cost benefit is kind of more helpful. So I'm just going to give you a couple of things to think about in terms of protecting yourself linguistically from cost, right, and maximizing benefit, and I'll give you some examples. So the first strategy that can be quite helpful to you is meta talk. So you're not necessarily directly replying to whatever is being said to you. You're leaving that level of the exchange and you're occupying a level above that where you start talking about what's actually happening in the room. This can be quite protective. So, as an example, I was doing some work with a team at one point and I was asked, "Do you have any children?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got a daughter." And then the person said, "Are you still with the mother?" Now, I didn't know this person. That was a very personal question. At that point, you could introduce meta talk and you could say something like, "You're exploring my boundaries." This does a couple of things. It removes you from the obligation to reply and the pressure to reply, but it also draws attention to the mechanism that's unfolding. Now the person who asked the question has a choice. Do they try to reshift the topic back to the level below, which was just talk, or do they engage with the meta talk? Right? So sometimes drawing attention to the mechanism rather than participating in the mechanism can be quite helpful and protective. If you want to stay at the level of talk and introduce some kind of linguistic self-defense at that level without going meta talk, you can position yourself in such a way that you're answering the question, but you're also sort of not answering the question. So, for example, I was once asked about my daughter. It was a conversation. She was a baby, and somebody, again, I didn't know very well, said, "I have to ask, was she planned?" Now, this puts me in a very difficult position. If I comply with the request, because I'm governed by politeness rules, I have to answer a question I may not be willing to answer. If I object to the question, I'm then doing conflict. I'm escalating the interaction. And the person who asked the question is then in the position to be able to say, "Oh, there's no need to get, angry about it." Or, so these questions are strategically important, right? Again, I'm not trying to say that these questions are good or bad questions or that these people are good or bad people. The focus should shift when you're thinking about this kind of interaction less from intent, which you can never really know, to effect. So what's the effect on me, and how do I respond based on the effect on me? Now, in that particular example, I was so blindsided by the brazenness of it that I just gave the answer to the question. But in retrospect, I could have said something like, is that important to you to know that? In that sense, I'm still engaging at the level of the talk. I'm not directly answering the question. I'm responding to the question with a question. And at that point, the person who asked the question then has to decide, what do I do with this? Because I've now taken the rhetorical force of the question and I've given it back, and I've said, well, let's explore whether or not this is a conversation that we should be having. And by returning the rhetorical force of the question back, by saying, well, is that something that's really important to you? I'm doing a couple of things. I'm not necessarily challenging their question. I'm showing curiosity for their motive, and I'm not assuming their motive. I'm letting them define their motive. But I am signaling pragmatically that my opinion is that answering that question is not particularly important, but I'm locating the responsibility for asking it back in the person. Now, I personally think, these are just a couple of examples, I personally think we should teach kids in schools linguistic self-defense. And the thing that gave me this idea was Harry Potter, right? If you think about what Harry Potter is, it's a load of kids who have magical powers. They all get shipped off to a wizard school, and on the curriculum there is defense against the dark arts. And I think that's what we need in schools. We need defense against the dark arts. We actually need to teach kids how to defend themselves linguistically, because we don't draw enough attention socially to the impact of language on our minds and our moods and our mental health. And if we had a curriculum where we were teaching kids, this is how to navigate linguistic ambiguity. This is how to assert boundaries in a non-confrontational way. These are the options that are available to you as speakers to assert your autonomy, and to position yourself in such a way that you don't escalate conflict without giving up your autonomy and just acquiescing, or becoming subservient or being obedient. There are ways to preserve your autonomy and keep the peace. And that's what we're going to teach you. I think that would be immensely valuable. And there would be knock-on psychological consequences. So, that's just a short video on linguistic kind of self-defense and things that you could think about and go looking for. If you find yourself in a situation where you're like, I don't like the way I was spoken to, I don't like the effect, I don't like how I feel as a result of that, that's a great starting point for looking into information about how you can respond to those things in ways that protect you psychologically and protect you relationally as well. So just a couple of things to think about, that's all.